As the floodwaters from Lake Pontchartrain finally receded from the first floor of the estate, my cell phone caught a weak signal. The screen illuminated the sweltering dark of the attic with dozens of text messages. At 8:15 in the morning, my father wrote that they had nowhere else to go and demanded I open the gate. At 10:45, my mother texted that they were freezing and begged me not to do this to them. 3 days earlier, my father filled his heavy-duty truck with emergency supplies, my mother, and my older brother. He left me behind to guard our Mandeville property from looters. He drove away and locked the heavy iron security gates from the outside. I survived a Category 4 storm surge trapped in the roof space with only a battery fan and an axe. Now the recovery teams are navigating the wreckage. My family expects to walk right back into the house they abandoned me in. They do not know I legally own the deed. Before I tell you how a commercial claims adjuster used the Louisiana tax code to evict her own flesh and blood, please take a second to like and subscribe to Maya Tells Stories. Only do this if you know the bitter sting of being treated as collateral damage by the people supposed to protect you. Drop your age and your location in the comments below. I read every single one. My name is Natalie. I am 31 years old. I evaluate structural disaster damage for corporate insurance firms. Let me take you back to the humid Tuesday morning when the hurricane was 12 hours away from the Gulf Coast. The air was thick with swamp heat. Louis, my 62-year-old father, was frantically strapping plastic storage bins into the bed of his pickup truck. Julian, my 34-year-old brother, stood on the wraparound porch holding a single duffel bag containing his expensive sneakers and a gaming console. Julian operated with the helpless urgency of a panicked child. Evelyn, my 60-year-old mother, was already sitting inside the truck cabin with the air conditioning running. Louis walked up the brick steps and handed me a heavy flashlight, a weather radio, and a roofing axe. He looked at the gray sky and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He explained we were initiating the Katrina protocol. He told me the looters would arrive the second the regional power grid failed. He said Julian and Evelyn needed to evacuate to a hotel in Baton Rouge because Julian lacked survival instincts. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. He did not sound evil. He sounded deeply convinced of his own twisted logic. He told me I was tough and pragmatic. He said I evaluated ruined buildings for a living, so I knew how to handle a storm. He mandated that I stay behind to protect the St. Tammany Parish estate. I looked at the elevation of the house. The foundation sat raised on concrete pillars. I calculated the projected wind speed in my head. A tight, cold knot formed in my stomach. 30 years of conditioned obedience kept my feet planted on the porch boards. I told him the storm surge forecasts were unpredictable. I asked him to let me get in the back seat. Louis dismissed my warning. He said the water would never breach the second floor, and the real danger was thieves stripping the copper wiring. He walked down the long driveway to the perimeter of the property. He pulled the two heavy iron security gates together. He engaged the manual deadbolt from the outside and pocketed the only physical key. He turned the estate into a fortress to keep thieves out. He did not realize he had just turned it into a watertight cage. The truck engine revved. My mother looked at me through the tinted passenger window. She raised a hand to her mouth, crying soft, guilty tears, but she did not unlock her door. They drove away. I stood alone on the porch, listening to the wind tear through the old oak trees. I looked at the axe in my hand and wondered if my pragmatic reputation was going to be the exact thing that got me killed. The red taillights of my father's truck disappeared around the bend of the oak-lined street. I stood alone on the wraparound porch of the Mandeville estate. The heavy iron security gates stood between the driveway and the main road. Louis had engaged the deadbolt from the outside and taken the physical key. I was locked in. I did not panic immediately. Panic is a useless metric when a Category 4 storm is spinning in the Gulf of Mexico. I tightened my grip on the heavy flashlight and walked the perimeter of the property. The air was thick. The familiar Louisiana swamp heat pressed against my skin. The birds were entirely silent. The barometric pressure was dropping fast. I cope with terror by relying on mathematics. I'm a commercial claims adjuster. I spend my days evaluating the skeletal remains of corporate infrastructure. I determine if a coastal warehouse collapsed due to wind shear or if the structural integrity failed because of flood inundation. I read elevation certificates and architectural blueprints for a living. I quantify ruin and assign it a dollar value. My brain automatically applied that same clinical lens to my childhood home. The estate was an Acadian-style build. It sat on heavy concrete pilings that raised the first floor 10 feet above the soft ground. The Federal Emergency Management Agency designated our specific neighborhood in St. Tammany Parish as an AE flood zone. That classification meant we were at a high risk for standing water. But standing water was a manageable variable if the engineering held. I walked beneath the raised floor and inspected the foundational pillars. The concrete was solid. I calculated the base flood elevation in my head. Louis had lived on the Gulf Coast his entire life. He predicted the storm surge would peak at 9 or 10 feet. He assured me the water would wash through the open space beneath the house without exerting fatal hydrostatic pressure against the load-bearing walls. I told myself my father was a seasoned veteran of hurricane season. He knew the local topography. He knew the behavior of Lake Pontchartrain. I leaned into a deep, clinical denial. I convinced myself the mathematics were on my side. The raised foundation would keep the living spaces dry. The second floor was a fortress. I was simply staying behind to guard dry drywall and antique furniture. I methodically checked every ground-level window. I pulled the heavy accordion hurricane shutters shut and locked the metal latches into place. I dragged the heavy teak patio furniture into the garage and secured the reinforced garage door. The wind began to pick up. It was no longer a steady breeze. It came in sharp, erratic gusts that rattled the loose Spanish moss hanging from the oak branches. I carried the battery fan, the emergency weather radio, and the heavy roofing axe up the solid oak staircase to the second floor. I set up a staging area in the master bedroom. I stacked the military ready-to-eat meals and the cases of bottled water Louis had left behind. I lined up fresh batteries on the nightstand. My mind treated the impending hurricane as a standard insurance claim. I visualized the federal adjusting guidelines. I calculated the potential damage. A few lost shingles, minor roof patching, maybe some wind-driven rain seeping through the window casings. Nothing catastrophic. I used the cold logic of my profession to suppress the primal terror crawling up my spine. While I organized the flashlights, I thought about my family driving toward the safety of Baton Rouge. Julian was 34 years old. He packed his expensive sneakers and a gaming console in his evacuation duffel bag. He possessed the emotional resilience of a toddler. If a tree branch hit the hotel roof, Julian would freeze. Evelyn would coddle him. Louis would have to manage them both. They left me behind because they deemed me capable. I was the designated shock absorber for the family. I handled the hard, uncomfortable realities so they could maintain their fragile peace. Julian failed his college courses, so I filled out his readmission paperwork. Julian launched a restaurant venture that bled capital, so I audited his ledgers and told him to declare bankruptcy. They assumed my career evaluating disaster zones made me immune to fear. But evaluating a destroyed building after the fact is entirely different from sitting inside one while the walls tear apart. I walked back down to the foyer. I secured the deadbolts on the heavy mahogany front doors. The mechanical click echoed in the empty hallway. I placed a rolled towel at the base of the doorframe to catch any seeping rainwater. I walked through the quiet kitchen and checked the pantry locks. I turned off the main water valve to prevent the municipal pipes from backing up into the sinks. I executed every standard preparation protocol. The sky bruised into a dark, unnatural purple. The wind changed pitch. It transformed from a series of erratic gusts into a low, continuous mechanical roar. The sound vibrated against the window panes. It felt like standing on the tarmac next to a running jet engine. I retreated up the stairs and sat on the second-floor landing. I looked down at the dark foyer. The power grid flickered and died. The house went pitch black. I turned on my flashlight and placed it on the floorboards. The pale beam cast long shadows across the walls. I sat in the dark and reviewed the Katrina protocol in my head. Louis did not lock the heavy iron security gates at the end of the driveway to keep the water out. Water does not care about iron spikes or deadbolts. He locked the gates to keep the neighbors out. He locked them to keep the looters out. I wrapped my arms around my knees. I stared at the roofing axe resting near my boots. Why was he so obsessed with thieves? Why did he risk the life of his own daughter to protect a collection of replaceable assets? I knew the insurance policy on the estate was robust. If the house washed away, the corporate carrier would issue a check. Property can always be rebuilt. The answer was not rooted in logic. The answer was buried in the toxic mud of the lower Ninth Ward. I closed my eyes and listened to the roaring wind. I thought about the ghost my father had been running from since 2005. He viewed property as the only tangible proof of a family's existence, because he had once watched his own history erased by desperate scavengers. His unhealed trauma dictated his every move, and as the barometric pressure plummeted toward historic lows, I realized his paranoid calculations were fundamentally flawed. He prepared for a war against human looters. He failed to prepare for the deadliest storm surge Lake Pontchartrain had ever produced. And I was trapped inside his mistake. The dark hallway of the second floor felt like a sensory deprivation chamber. The power grid had failed hours ago. The only illumination came from the pale beam of my heavy flashlight resting on the oak floorboards. Outside the thick hurricane shutters, the wind howled with a relentless mechanical roar. I sat with my knees pulled to my chest and listened to the structure of my childhood home groan under the wind shear. To understand why I was sitting alone in the dark, waiting for a hurricane to make landfall, you have to understand the psychology of my father. Louis is not a cartoon villain who woke up one morning and decided to sacrifice his daughter. His decisions are governed by a strict internal logic forged in the aftermath of a historic disaster. He is a man permanently defined by the first week of September in 2005. 19 years ago, Hurricane Katrina drowned the coast. My father grew up in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans. His childhood home was a modest cinder block house built by his grandfather. After the levees broke and the floodwaters finally drained back into the Gulf, Louis drove his truck through the military checkpoints to inspect the ruin. He waded through waist-deep toxic sludge. The heat index hovered near 100 degrees. The neighborhood smelled of raw sewage, diesel fuel, and decay. He reached his family property expecting to find severe water inundation. He expected ruined drywall and warped floorboards. He was prepared to fight the insurance companies over flood coverage. He was not prepared for what he actually found. The front door of his childhood home was not blown open by the wind. It was kicked off its hinges by heavy boots. Louis walked into the living room and discovered a scene of deliberate human destruction. The water had ruined the furniture, but scavengers had stripped the soul of the house. The drywall was smashed to pieces so thieves could extract the raw copper pipes. The custom wooden cabinets were pried off the walls. He walked into the master bedroom. The mattress was overturned. Lying in the center of the mud-covered floor was a small wooden jewelry box. His grandfather had carved that box by hand. It held his mother's pearls and a collection of silver heirlooms dating back 3 generations. Louis picked up the box. The brass latch was broken. The interior velvet was stained and empty. The storm took the drywall, but desperate men took his legacy. That moment broke a fundamental mechanism in my father's brain. He realized that a corporate insurance carrier can cut a check to replace a roof, but a check cannot buy back a grandmother's wedding ring. A check does not restore the physical anchor of a family history. If scavengers erase your footprint, your legacy ceases to exist. He developed a profound, rigid belief that property is the only tangible proof that a family matters. This trauma explains every action he took on the porch 12 hours ago. He did not look at me and see a disposable child. He looked at my older brother Julian and saw a weak, frantic boy who would hand over the keys to the first scavenger who knocked on the door. Julian panicked when the wireless internet router malfunctioned. He would never survive a grid collapse. My father looked at my mother Evelyn and saw a fragile enabler who would freeze in terror at the sound of breaking glass. Then he looked at me. He saw a 31-year-old commercial claims adjuster. He saw a woman who walked through the skeletal remains of burned warehouses and flooded office buildings for a living. He saw my clinical detachment. He saw my independence. Louis did not abandon me out of cruelty. He deployed me as his best asset. He handed me the roofing axe, the weather radio, and the heavy flashlight because he was knighting me as the protector of his rebuilt legacy. He stacked the military ready-to-eat meals and the spare batteries on the nightstand. He dragged the heavy battery-powered fan upstairs to combat the suffocating swamp heat that always follows a Gulf storm. He genuinely believed he was providing me with an impenetrable bunker. When he pulled those heavy wrought iron security gates shut at the end of the driveway, he was not trying to lock me in. He was trying to lock the ghost of 2005 out. He engaged the manual deadbolt and pocketed the physical key to ensure no desperate scavenger could drive a truck onto the estate and strip the copper wiring. He turned the Mandeville property into a vault. I sat on the landing and stared at the supplies he left me. A tragic misunderstanding is far more dangerous than intentional malice. A villain leaves you to die, but a traumatized parent builds a cage and calls it a sanctuary. I turned off the flashlight to conserve the battery. The darkness pressed against my eyes. The wind continued its deafening assault against the exterior siding. I evaluated his strategy using the cold, pragmatic metrics of my profession. His logic was flawless if the primary threat was human. The iron gates would repel looters. The heavy deadbolts would secure the perimeter. The raised concrete pilings would elevate the first floor above a standard seasonal flood. He had engineered a perfect defense against the exact disaster he experienced 2 decades ago. But Louis made a fatal error in his underwriting. He prepared for men. He failed to prepare for the brutal, unforgiving physics of nature. Lake Pontchartrain is a massive, shallow estuary. It sits directly south of our parish. When a strong hurricane spins into the Gulf, the counterclockwise winds function like a giant turbine. The storm scoops up the Gulf water and forces it directly into the lake. The estuary cannot contain the sudden extreme influx of volume. The water has nowhere to go but up and out. My father assured me the surge would never top 12 feet. He based his mathematical projection on historical averages and blind optimism. He refused to acknowledge that a Category 4 system carries a distinct atmospheric pressure capable of pushing a 20-foot wall of toxic brine over the seawalls. The environment around me began to shift. The barometric pressure plummeted so fast my ears popped. The sensation was sharp and deeply uncomfortable. The steady, mechanical roar of the wind fractured. A new frequency joined the chaotic symphony outside. It was a deep, guttural rumbling. It sounded like a dozen freight trains rolling simultaneously across a wooden bridge. The floorboards beneath my boots vibrated. The heavy oak staircase groaned in protest. My clinical detachment evaporated. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew exactly what that rumbling meant. The wind was no longer the primary destructive force. The seawall holding back Lake Pontchartrain had failed. The lake was loose. It was moving north through the Mandeville streets, swallowing vehicles, tearing through residential blocks, and hunting for higher ground. I stood up and gripped the handle of the roofing axe. I walked to the edge of the stairwell and pointed the beam of my flashlight down toward the dark foyer. The rolled towel I had placed near the base of the mahogany front doors was already soaked. A thin stream of dark brown liquid was seeping under the doorframe. The water did not gently rise like a tide. It arrived as a battering ram. The heavy iron security gate my father locked to protect me was currently standing directly in the path of a catastrophic storm surge, and I was standing on the wrong side of the deadbolt. I stood on the second-floor landing and watched the thin stream of water seep under the mahogany front doors. The beam of my flashlight trembled across the foyer tile. The deep, guttural rumbling outside grew louder. It swallowed the howling wind. It sounded like the earth itself was tearing apart. The seawall holding back Lake Pontchartrain had failed. The estuary was empty, and the parish was now the lakebed. As a commercial claims adjuster, I understand the grim physics of a storm surge. People often confuse a surge with a flash flood. A flash flood is a rapid accumulation of rainfall. A storm surge is a solid wall of dense ocean water pushed inland by sustained cyclonic pressure. It does not flow, it bulldozes. It carries immense weight. Every cubic yard of seawater weighs over 1,700 pounds. The raised concrete pilings beneath my childhood home were designed to withstand heavy rainfall. They were not engineered to repel a localized tsunami. The rumbling reached the perimeter of the estate. I knew the exact moment the water hit the heavy iron security gates my father had locked. A harsh, metallic groan echoed through the dark. The wrought iron held firm against the initial impact. Louis had installed deep concrete footings to keep scavengers out. He succeeded in building a fortress. The gates stood tall, but the water simply rushed right through the vertical iron bars. The lake bypassed his security measures in 3 seconds. The surge hit the foundation. The entire Acadian-style house shuddered. The floorboards beneath my boots shifted. The structural framing groaned under the sudden, staggering hydrostatic pressure. My father had promised the water would never top 12 feet. He based his safety on blind hope. The lake did not care about his optimism. I aimed the flashlight down the oak staircase. The thin stream of water in the foyer was no longer seeping under the doorframe. The water level outside had already submerged the front porch. The pressure against the heavy mahogany doors was building to a critical threshold. The breach did not happen at the front of the house, it happened at the rear. The estate featured a wall of custom French doors opening onto the backyard patio. I heard the distinct, agonizing crack of buckling wood. A split second later, the tempered glass shattered. The sound was deafening. It sounded like a bomb detonating in the kitchen. The toxic brown water of Lake Pontchartrain poured into the first floor. It did not trickle. It roared into the living space. The surge carried the foul stench of marsh mud, raw sewage, and spilled diesel fuel from the nearby marinas. The temperature inside the house dropped as the cold brine flooded the rooms. I watched the destruction of my father's legacy unfold in real time. The custom furniture he spent decades accumulating became immediate debris. A heavy leather sofa floated past the bottom of the staircase and smashed into the drywall. The antique dining table flipped over and splintered against the kitchen island. The tangible proof of our family existence was erased in less than a minute. The items he valued more than my safety were reduced to toxic garbage. The water level in the foyer rose with terrifying speed. It swallowed the first step of the oak staircase, then the second step, then the third. The raised foundation had bought me perhaps 10 minutes of dry time. The surge was pushing higher, hunting for the second floor. My clinical detachment snapped. The professional adjuster who quantified ruin for corporate carriers died on that landing. My brain could no longer process the data using cold mathematics. The primal instinct for survival hijacked my nervous system. My pulse throbbed in my throat. My lungs burned as I gasped for air. I was looking at my own impending death rising up the stairs. I broke. I lost every ounce of my pragmatic composure. I gripped the heavy roofing axe in my right hand and the flashlight in my left. I backed away from the stairwell. The water crested the halfway point of the steps. It was climbing too fast. The second floor was no longer a safe harbor. It was a waiting room for a drowning. I opened my mouth and let out a raw, ugly shriek. I did not scream for help. The wind would swallow any plea for rescue. I screamed out of pure, unadulterated terror. I cursed the rising tide. I cursed the shattered French doors. I screamed obscenities at my father for leaving me in this trap. I yelled at the dark, empty hallway while the brown water reached the top of the stairs and began pooling onto the second-floor hardwood. I had to get higher. The ceiling above the hallway contained a sealed access panel leading to the unfinished attic. It was a small square of painted drywall secured by heavy metal brackets. I did not have a pull-down ladder. I did not have the time to find a chair. The toxic brine washed over the toes of my boots. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered against the floor and rolled into the rising water, the beam pointing erratically toward the ceiling. I swung the roofing axe with both hands. I did not aim with precision. I struck the attic access panel with blind, frantic force. The sharp blade bit into the drywall. Plaster dust rained down on my face. I swung again. The wood trim splintered. I swung a third time, screaming with every strike, using my panic to fuel my muscles. The panel cracked in half and gave way. A square of pitch-black darkness opened above my head. I threw the axe through the opening. I reached up and grabbed the jagged edges of the broken wood frame. I did not test the structural integrity. I pulled my body weight upward. The raw splinters sliced deep into the palms of my hands. I felt the sharp sting of exposed nails tearing the skin on my forearms. Warm blood mixed with the cold, dirty lake water soaking my clothes. I ignored the pain. I kicked my boots against the hallway wall, fighting for leverage. I scrambled through the narrow hatch. My chest scraped against the rough timber. I hauled myself over the edge and collapsed onto the fiberglass insulation covering the attic floor joists. I rolled onto my back in the pitch-black roof space. The heat up here was instantaneous and suffocating. The unventilated attic trapped the thick, humid swamp air. I lay on the scratchy fiberglass, bleeding and hyperventilating. I sucked greedy, ragged breaths into my burning lungs. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pressed my bleeding hands against my chest, trying to slow my erratic breathing. Below me, I heard the dark water sloshing against the walls of the second-floor bedrooms. The surge had consumed the entire living space. I had escaped the immediate drowning, but the reality of my new situation settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. I was marooned in a sweltering, dark box. I had a battery fan and a few ready-to-eat meals. I had no radio and no cell service. I was bleeding into the insulation. The storm would eventually blow north and the wind would die down, but my survival was far from guaranteed. The water filling the yard was a dozen feet deep. A recovery truck could never navigate the flooded streets. The only rescue possible would come from the local flatboat volunteers. But Lewis had locked the heavy iron security gates at the end of the driveway. The thick iron spikes would puncture any aluminum boat that tried to cross the property line. My father had built an impenetrable fortress to protect his legacy. He had successfully designed a vault so secure that even the people trying to save my life would not be able to get inside. The relentless roar of the Category 4 hurricane finally faded into a heavy, eerie stillness. The storm pushed north toward Mississippi and left a humid, swampy devastation in its wake. The unventilated attic space quickly transitioned from a dark sanctuary into a sweltering oven. The August sun beat down on the asphalt shingles inches above my head. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees. I sat on the rough fiberglass insulation. My clothes were stiff with dried, muddy water. The raw splinters from the broken access panel throbbed in the palms of my hands. Sweat stung the open cuts. I turned on the small battery-powered fan my father had left me. It did not cool the room. It only pushed the thick, stifling air in a slow circle. I crawled toward the gable vent at the front of the house. The wooden louvers were angled downward to block rain, but I could peer through the narrow slats. The view of my childhood neighborhood was unrecognizable. The manicured lawns, the mailbox posts, and the fire hydrants were gone. A stagnant lake of toxic brown water covered the Mandeville streets. The surge had stabilized at roughly 8 feet deep across our property. The tops of submerged sedans peeked through the muddy surface like dead steel islands. The smell of raw sewage, rotting vegetation, and spilled gasoline rose from the standing water and drifted through the attic vent. I rested my forehead against the rough wood frame. I was alive. The concrete pilings supporting the house had held firm against the hydrostatic pressure. My clinical calculation regarding the structural engineering proved correct. But my survival was currently confined to a 50-square-foot wooden box baking under the Louisiana sun. A distinct mechanical noise broke the morning silence. It was a high-pitched whine followed by a low, rhythmic putter. I recognized the sound of a 2-stroke outboard motor. I pressed my face against the louvered vent. Half a mile down the flooded street, a small, flat-bottom aluminum boat navigated around the floating debris. The vessel belonged to the Cajun Navy. They are an informal, grassroots network of local fishermen, hunters, and ordinary citizens who deploy their personal watercraft to rescue stranded residents when the federal and municipal agencies are overwhelmed. They operate with john boats and simple rigging, dragging people off roofs and out of second-story windows. Hope is a dangerous emotion when you are trapped. It hijacks your rational mind and replaces it with desperate energy. I grabbed the heavy flashlight. I shoved the handle through the wooden slats of the vent and banged it repeatedly against the exterior siding. The hollow thud echoed across the flooded water. I yelled through the opening until my throat felt like sandpaper. The man sitting near the tiller of the aluminum boat heard the noise. He adjusted the outboard motor and steered the vessel toward the estate. A second man stood near the bow, holding a long wooden push-pole, scanning the murky water for submerged hazards. They wore simple chest waders and fishing shirts. They navigated past the submerged mailboxes and approached the perimeter of our property. The boat slowed to an idle. The man at the bow used the wooden pole to push the aluminum hull forward. Then the boat hit a solid, immovable barrier. A harsh metallic scrape echoed across the yard. The rescue vessel had reached the edge of the driveway. They were separated from the front porch by 40 yards of standing water. But standing between the boat and the house were the heavy wrought iron security gates Louis had locked the previous morning. The iron gate stood 12 feet tall. The floodwaters covered the lower 8 feet. 4 feet of thick black iron bars protruded above the brown surface. The top of every vertical bar ended in a sharpened iron finial shaped like a spearhead. My father designed those gates to prevent delivery trucks from entering without clearance and to stop scavengers from hauling away stolen appliances. He engaged the manual deadbolt on the exterior latch to create an impenetrable perimeter. The man at the bow yelled up toward the attic vent. His voice carried the thick, familiar accent of the southern parishes. He asked how many people were trapped inside the roof. I yelled back that I was alone. I begged them to bring the boat to the second-floor balcony so I could hack my way through the siding. The man at the tiller shook his head. He pointed down at the protruding iron spikes. He yelled that his hull was thin-gauge aluminum. The water level was too high to open the gate, but too low to glide over the top. If they attempted to push the flat-bottom boat over the sharp iron finials, the metal would tear open like a soda can. The vessel would sink in the toxic mud, and they would become casualties themselves. He asked if I possessed a remote override switch for the gate mechanism. I pressed my bleeding hands against the wooden slats. The reality of my father's paranoia settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I yelled that the power grid was dead and the motor was submerged. I told them my father engaged a manual steel deadbolt on the outside of the latch. He took the physical key to Baton Rouge. The two men in the boat exchanged a long, grim look. In a disaster zone, triage dictates survival. Rescuers cannot sacrifice their equipment and their own lives for a single trapped individual when dozens of accessible families are waiting on nearby roofs. The man at the bow yelled up to me with a tone of genuine, helpless apology. He said they could not breach the iron hinges without industrial bolt cutters or an acetylene torch. He told me they had to turn back and find a rescue crew equipped with heavy breaching tools. He promised they would map my coordinates and return as soon as possible. The man at the tiller engaged the outboard motor. The propeller churned the brown water. The aluminum boat reversed away from the iron spikes, turned around, and disappeared down the flooded street. I watched the wake ripple against the tops of the gates. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. I slid down the attic wall and sat on the fiberglass insulation. I pulled my knees to my chest. The battery fan hummed a useless rhythm in the dark. Hours passed. The sun reached its zenith. The temperature in the roof space became a physical weight pressing against my lungs. I drank a warm bottle of water and watched the shadows shift across the wooden rafters. The Cajun Navy did not return. The local rescue networks were dealing with thousands of flooded homes, breached levees, and critical medical emergencies. A single woman trapped in a dry attic behind an intact iron perimeter was a low priority on the municipal dispatch list. Louis had achieved his primary objective. He successfully turned the Mandeville estate into a watertight vault. He protected the empty drywall and the floating antique furniture from human scavengers. His Katrina trauma dictated that a locked door equates to safety. He failed to understand that a locked door protects the person holding the key. It does not protect the person left on the wrong side of the deadbolt. The security measures designed to keep thieves out were now executing a flawless blockade against the people trying to save my life. As the oppressive swamp heat baked the remaining oxygen out of the attic, my mind drifted away from the physical danger. The clinical detachment I used in my professional career slowly began to process the deeper truth behind my father's decisions. I thought about the actual value of the property I was currently dying to protect. I thought about the hidden ledgers, the unpaid parish taxes, and the profound financial failures of my older brother Julian. The true tragedy was not just that my family risked my life for a house. The true tragedy was that they risked my life for a house they technically abandoned years ago. The afternoon sun hammered the asphalt shingles just inches above my head. The unventilated roof space transformed into a kiln. Every breath I pulled into my lungs felt like drawing air through a hot, wet wool blanket. My clothes clung to my skin, stiff with dried swamp water and my own sweat. The fiberglass insulation scratched against my bare arms. I sat in the dark and listened to the battery fan hum its useless mechanical rhythm. When your body reaches a certain threshold of thermal exhaustion, your brain stops processing the immediate physical danger. It retreats. It searches for a cold, rational anchor to tether your fading consciousness. I could not think about the toxic brown lake drowning my neighborhood. I could not think about the Cajun Navy boat that turned away. I forced my mind to focus on the numbers. I evaluated the structural asset I was currently dying to protect. My father locked me behind iron bars to guard our family legacy. He treated the Acadian estate like a sacred monument to his survival. But the irony of my situation was a bitter metallic taste in my dry mouth. I was guarding a financial ghost. To understand the profound hypocrisy of my father's paranoia, you have to look at Julian. My older brother was 34 years old. He possessed the charm of a seasoned politician and the financial literacy of a teenager. 3 years ago, Julian decided he wanted to be a restaurateur. He leased a premium retail space in downtown Covington. He envisioned a high-end Cajun fusion dining experience. He wanted the prestige of ownership without the grueling hours of operational management. Julian spent money on aesthetics instead of infrastructure. He bought imported Italian espresso machines and custom leather booth seating. He hired an expensive marketing firm to design a sleek logo. He did all of this while ignoring the stacking invoices from the local seafood and produce distributors. He did not understand food costs. He did not understand labor margins. The restaurant bled cash from the day the doors opened. Within 9 months, the vendors stopped delivering. The staff walked out due to bounced paychecks. The venture collapsed. Most parents would allow a 31-year-old man to face the consequences of a failed business. They would advise him to declare corporate bankruptcy and find a job to pay off his remaining debts. Louis is not most parents. The trauma he suffered during Hurricane Katrina dictated that any failure was an erasure of the family footprint. He could not tolerate the public humiliation of his son defaulting on a commercial lease in our own parish. He viewed Julian's failure as a crack in the pristine armor he had spent 2 decades building. My father stepped in to serve as the ultimate shock absorber. He liquidated his stock portfolios. He drained his liquid retirement accounts. He paid off the angry vendors and bought out the remaining years on the Covington lease to keep the family name out of the local court dockets. He saved Julian from ruin. But saving the golden child required an exorbitant sum of capital. Louis depleted his cash reserves. He refused to downsize his lifestyle. He kept his heavy-duty truck. He kept Evelyn in her expensive country club memberships. He maintained the polished, affluent exterior of the Mandeville estate. To fund this illusion, he had to cut expenses in the shadows. He chose to stop paying the street. Tammany Parish property taxes. He assumed he could float the delinquency for a year or two until his logistics routes generated enough surplus to catch up. He assumed the municipal government operated with the same slow bureaucracy as a bank. He misunderstood the brutal efficiency of the Louisiana tax code. I discovered his secret 2 years ago while sitting in my sterile corporate office in New Orleans. I was working on a complex insurance claim for a commercial lot located just a few miles from my childhood home. I needed to verify the flood zone history. I logged into the parish assessor database. It is a public portal used by underwriters and real estate attorneys to trace property lines and tax histories. Out of pure, idle curiosity, I typed in our family address. I hit the search key. The screen populated with a grid of red text. The data was glaring and undeniable. The property taxes were delinquent for 3 consecutive years. In Louisiana, the parish does not immediately evict a homeowner for unpaid taxes. They use a system designed to recover the municipal revenue without dealing with the hassle of property management. The parish hosts an annual tax auction. They sell a tax certificate to third-party investors. The investor pays the back taxes owed to the government. In exchange, the investor receives a lien against the property and the right to collect severe statutory interest. The homeowner is granted a strict 3-year redemptive period. If they pay the investor back within 36 months, the lien is cleared. If they fail to redeem the certificate before the clock runs out, the investor can file a petition for monition. That specific legal action strips the original owner of all rights and quiets the title. The investor becomes the sole legal owner of the dirt and the structure. I sat at my desk and stared at the red text on my monitor. An out-of-state holding company had purchased the tax certificate for the Mandeville estate. The 3-year redemptive period was ticking away. Louis had risked everything to save Julian from a bruised ego. In the process, he had quietly forfeited the very legacy he claimed was the most important thing in the world. He kept the iron gates painted. He kept the lawn mowed. But legally, the house was slipping through his fingers. The bitter realization settled over me in the sweltering heat of the attic. I wiped a mixture of sweat and plaster dust from my forehead. My father handed me a roofing axe and a flashlight. He looked me in the eye and told me to guard the walls from scavengers. He locked me in a watertight cage to protect a collection of antique furniture and drywall. But the true thief had already bypassed the iron gates. The thief was my brother's incompetence and my father's pride. I was baking in a roof space, bleeding into fiberglass insulation, guarding a piece of property my family had technically abandoned to a tax auction. They left me behind because they thought I was resilient. They traded my safety for an illusion of wealth. A sharp cramp in my abdomen interrupted my thoughts. The psychological pain of my family betrayal faded into the background. A far more urgent biological crisis demanded my attention. I had been sitting in the suffocating heat for nearly 10 hours. I'd consumed my only bottle of water shortly after the Cajun Navy boat turned away. The temperature in the attic was severely dehydrating my body. My mouth felt like it was coated in dry sand. My lips were cracked. A dull, throbbing headache pulsed behind my eyes. I recognized the early symptoms of heat stroke. If I remained in the unventilated roof space, my internal temperature would reach a fatal threshold. My organs would begin to shut down. The clinical detachment I used to analyze my father's tax failure could not lower my core temperature. I had to move. I had to leave the dry safety of the attic and descend back into the ruins of the second floor. The storm surge had submerged the lower half of the house, but the plumbing on the upper level might still hold a few drops of residual liquid. I needed water. I crawled across the rough insulation. My blistered hands throbbed as I gripped the jagged edges of the broken access hatch. I swung my legs over the side and lowered myself down into the dark, humid hallway below. I did not know that the search for a simple drink of water was about to break my professional armor into 1,000 pieces. I was about to face a physical and mental collapse that would strip away every ounce of my pragmatic pride. The descent from the attic back down to the second-floor hallway required a grim physical toll. My boots slipped against the ruined drywall below the access hatch. The raw splinters from the broken wood trim caught the fabric of my shirt, tearing the cloth and reopening the shallow cuts on my forearms. I landed heavily on the flooded hardwood floor. The water level inside the house had dropped slightly as the storm surge equalized across the neighborhood. The toxic brine no longer covered the entire second story, but a thick layer of slick brown mud coated the hallway. The smell was overpowering. The air was a heavy stew of rotting marsh grass, raw sewage backed up through the municipal lines, and stagnant diesel fuel. I leaned against the hallway wall to steady myself. The symptoms of severe dehydration were escalating rapidly. My vision blurred around the edges, tumbling into a narrow field of focus. My tongue felt swollen. Every swallow was a dry, agonizing scrape against my throat. I had been trapped without clean hydration for nearly 3 days. The human body can survive weeks without food, but it shuts down violently without water. I dragged my boots through the muck. I walked toward the master bathroom at the end of the hall. The heavy oak door was swollen from the moisture. I gripped the brass handle and shoved it with my shoulder, forcing the worked wood to scrape against the tile floor. The bathroom was dark. The thick accordion hurricane shutters blocked the punishing afternoon sun, but they also trapped the suffocating swamp heat inside the small room. I turned on my flashlight. The pale beam cut through the humid air. I aimed the light at the large porcelain bathtub. When I executed my emergency preparations before the hurricane made landfall, I followed the standard local protocol. I scrubbed the tub clean with bleach and filled it to the brim with municipal tap water. It was meant to serve as a backup reservoir to flush the toilets if the parish water pressure failed. The storm surge had altered that plan. When the brown water of Lake Pontchartrain breached the second floor, it flooded the bathroom. The toxic brine mixed with the clean tap water in the tub. As the water level slowly receded, it left behind a grim, contaminated pool. I stared down into the porcelain basin. The remaining water was a murky, yellowish brown. A thin, oily sheen of gasoline floated on the surface. Dead insects and bits of shredded insulation floated in the corners. It was stale, warm, and entirely unfit for human consumption. My clinical detachment screamed at me to walk away. Drinking contaminated floodwater is a guaranteed path to severe gastrointestinal distress, dysentery, or a fatal bacterial infection. My brain, wired to evaluate risk and calculate probabilities, calculated the exact percentage of pathogens swimming in that tub. But profound biological thirst overrides logic. It silences the underwriter. The primal demand for hydration hijacked my nervous system. I dropped the heavy flashlight onto the dirty tile. I fell to my knees beside the bathtub. I did not use a cup. I did not filter the liquid through my shirt. I cupped my dirty, bleeding hands and plunged them into the murky water. I brought my hands to my face and drank. The water tasted like mud and copper. It was tepid and thick with grit. I swallowed it fast, trying to bypass my taste buds. I scooped another handful and drank again. I consumed the contaminated water until my stomach cramped violently in protest. I leaned back against the bathroom cabinets. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. The realization of what I had just done hit me harder than the physical nausea. I was a successful corporate professional. I wore tailored blazers. I sat in sterile boardrooms evaluating multi-million-dollar insurance portfolios. I prided myself on my fierce independence and my cold, pragmatic resilience. And yet here I was, crouching in a dark, ruined bathroom, drinking toxic sludge from a dirty bathtub, just to survive another hour. The tough adjuster persona fractured. The armor cracked and fell away. I pulled my knees to my chest and wrapped my arms tightly around my legs. I bowed my head. The first sob tore from my throat like a physical wound. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a raw, ugly breakdown. My shoulders shook violently. I gasped for air, inhaling the foul scent of the sewage. I wept from the sheer, crushing weight of the isolation. I cried because my hands hurt. I cried because I was terrified of dying in a dark, swampy cage. But the deepest agony came from the silence of my cell phone. Before the battery on my device died, I had checked the emergency broadcast frequencies. The local news stations reported that the Cajun Navy and the federal rescue teams were executing grid searches across St. Tammany Parish. They were prioritizing addresses based on emergency distress calls routed through the regional dispatch centers. Families who had evacuated were calling the authorities to report relatives trapped in specific flooded zones. I knew my father was sitting in a dry hotel room in Baton Rouge. I knew my mother was watching the news coverage. I knew my brother had his gaming console and a working cellular signal. Yet not a single rescue boat had arrived at the Iron Gates since the initial flatboat turned away on day 2. The conclusion was an undeniable mathematical certainty. My family had not called the authorities. They had not filed a missing persons report. They had not begged the Coast Guard to dispatch a helicopter to the Mandeville estate. Louis had locked me inside a fortress to protect his antique dining table and his drywall. When the levee broke and the neighborhood drowned, he assumed my resilience would keep me safe. He assumed my pragmatic nature meant I did not require a rescue. He relied on my strength to absolve himself of guilt. I sobbed against the cold, wet tile. I cursed my own obedience. I hated myself for standing on the porch and accepting the roofing axe. I hated my father for turning his unhealed trauma into my death sentence. I cried until my eyes were swollen and my chest ached. The breakdown stripped me down to the bare, terrified core of my existence. I lay on the bathroom floor for a long time. The shadows in the dark room grew longer. The heat began to dissipate slightly as the sun dipped lower toward the horizon. The human mind can only sustain absolute despair for a limited period. Eventually, the primal urge to fight claws its way back to the surface. The tears stopped. The nausea from the dirty water settled into a dull, tolerable ache in my gut. I slowly pushed myself off the floor. My muscles felt like lead. I picked up the heavy flashlight. I walked out of the bathroom and back into the ruined hallway. I remembered my waterproof go-bag sitting on the staging area in the master bedroom. I had packed it weeks before hurricane season began. It contained my spare clothes, my corporate identification, and a sealed plastic folder holding critical financial documents. I thought about the red text on the parish assessor database 2 years ago. I thought about the out-of-state holding company that purchased the tax certificate for my childhood home. The bitter realization that I was guarding an abandoned asset sparked a sudden, sharp clarity in my mind. I walked into the master bedroom. I aimed the flashlight at the bright orange waterproof bag. The tough, pragmatic adjuster was returning. I wiped the remaining tears from my dirty face. My family had left me to die, protecting a house they no longer owned. But they did not know the final move I had made to correct their failure. I reached into the bag and pulled out the sealed plastic folder. The paperwork inside was the only reason I had agreed to stay behind. It was the ultimate leverage. The legal weapon I had forged in silence was about to change the entire dynamic of my survival. I stood in the ruined master bedroom and held the bright orange waterproof bag. The ambient light in the room was dim, filtering through the cracks in the heavy hurricane shutters. The air smelled of wet rot and desperation. My breakdown on the bathroom tile had purged the terror from my system. The tears were gone. What remained was a cold, reviving clarity. The primal panic was replaced by the familiar clinical focus of a woman who evaluated disasters for a living. I unrolled the top of the dry bag. I reached inside and bypassed the spare clothes and the emergency medical kit. I pulled out a heavy, sealed plastic folder. Inside the folder rested a stack of legal documents printed on heavy stock paper. I aimed the beam of my flashlight at the top page. The bold black text at the header read, "Final Judgment, Quieting Title." To understand why this specific piece of paper was sitting in my emergency bag while a Category 4 storm destroyed the parish, you have to look back 3 years. My brother Julian had launched a restaurant venture in downtown Covington. He purchased imported espresso machines and custom leather booths while ignoring his vendor invoices. The business collapsed spectacularly. My father Louis drained his retirement accounts to bail Julian out of the commercial lease and save the family reputation from the local court dockets. Louis functioned as the ultimate shock absorber for his golden child. To fund the bailout, Louis quietly stopped paying the St. Tammany Parish property taxes on the Mandeville estate. He assumed he could float the delinquency. He believed the municipal government operated with the same slow grace as a forgiving bank. He drastically underestimated the brutal efficiency of the Louisiana Department of Revenue. I discovered the delinquency 2 years ago while running a routine title search for a corporate insurance claim. I logged into the parish assessor database and saw the glaring red text next to my childhood address. The taxes were unpaid. The parish had already executed a tax sale. In Louisiana, the government does not evict a homeowner immediately when they miss a tax payment. They auction off a tax certificate to third-party investors. The investor pays the delinquent taxes to the parish. In exchange, the investor receives a lien against the property. The original homeowner is granted a strict 3-year redemptive period to pay the investor back with severe statutory interest. If the homeowner fails to redeem the certificate before the 36-month clock expires, the investor can file a specific legal action known as a petition for monition. This lawsuit formally strips the original owner of all rights and quiets the title. The investor becomes the sole legal owner of the dirt and the structure. I stared at the assessor database 2 years ago and saw that an out-of-state holding company had purchased the tax certificate for the Mandeville estate. Louis was completely oblivious. He was mowing the lawn and painting the iron security gates of a property he was actively losing. I did not call my father to warn him. I knew exactly how he would react. He He would panic. He would scramble to secure a predatory high-interest loan to pay off the holding company. He would leverage his logistics routes to save the house, effectively bankrupting his business to protect his antique dining table. Instead of alerting him, I executed a flawless financial maneuver. I contacted the out-of-state holding company. They were a massive private equity firm that bought thousands of tax certificates across the Gulf Coast in bulk. They did not care about the physical property. They only cared about the interest yield. I used my own corporate salary and my carefully hoarded savings to buy the tax certificate directly from the holding company. I transferred the lien into a blind, limited liability company registered under my name. I became the investor holding the debt on my father's estate. For 2 years, I watched Louis maintain the illusion of wealth. He hosted Sunday dinners. He criticized my modest apartment in the city. He praised Julian's new job at a logistics firm. He never once mentioned the property taxes. He operated under the profound delusion that the house was secure. I tracked the calendar meticulously. The 3-year redemptive period ticked away. Day by day, month by month, the clock moved toward the absolute statutory deadline. Louis never paid the parish. He never attempted to clear the lien. When the 36-month window finally slammed shut, I hired a sharp local real estate attorney. We filed the petition for monition in the St. Tammany Parish Court. The legal process required publishing a formal notice in the local newspaper, warning any interested parties that the title was being quieted. Louis did not read the legal notices in the back of the local paper. He missed the final warning. The judge reviewed the petition. The timeline was irrefutable. The taxes remained unredeemed. Exactly 5 days before the hurricane spun into the Gulf of Mexico, the judge brought his gavel down. He signed the final judgment. He transferred the title of the multi-million-dollar Mandeville estate entirely to my blind LLC. I stood in the sweltering master bedroom holding the stamped judgment. The raised seal on the paper reflected the beam of my flashlight. My family had driven away in a heavy-duty truck and left me to guard the walls from looters. They assumed I was a disposable asset, capable of surviving the storm. They risked my life to protect a house they technically abandoned financially. They did not know that the woman bleeding into the fiberglass insulation of the attic was the sole legal owner of the estate. The cold clarity hardened my resolve. The toxic water had ruined the antique furniture. The surge had shattered the French doors. But the underlying dirt, the raised concrete pilings, and the commercial insurance policy attached to the structure belonged exclusively to me. I carefully slid the legal documents back into the sealed plastic folder. I secured the roll-top closure of the waterproof bag. I slung the heavy strap over my shoulder. The physical toll of the dehydration and the heat remained, but the psychological defeat was gone. I was no longer a victim trapped in a watertight cage. I was a property owner surveying her asset. I walked out of the master bedroom and stepped back into the ruined hallway. The water level outside the house was beginning to drop. The storm surge was finally draining back into Lake Pontchartrain. I could hear the slow, steady sloshing of the receding floodwaters against the exterior siding. The isolation was nearing its end. The water would eventually clear the street. The recovery teams would arrive, and shortly after the parish roads became passable, my family would return. They would expect to drive through the iron gates, survey the damage, and claim the massive insurance payout to rebuild their lives elsewhere. They expected a compliant daughter waiting on the porch. They were about to encounter a hostile landlord armed with a roofing axe and an eviction notice. The relentless draining of the storm surge took another 14 hours. The dark brown water slowly pulled back from the walls of the second floor, retreating down the oak staircase like a retreating army. The sound of the water sloshing against the dry wall faded into a heavy, eerie stillness. The mechanical roar of the hurricane was a distant memory. The only noise remaining was the steady drip of residual moisture falling from the ceiling fixtures onto the ruined floorboards. I waited until the water level in the foyer dropped below my knees before I attempted to leave the upper level. I carried the heavy waterproof go bag slung securely across my chest. I gripped the wooden handle of the roofing axe in my right hand. I descended the stairs carefully. The thick coating of slick, toxic mud made every step a dangerous hazard. The smell of the lower floor was staggering. The swamp water had mixed with the ruptured municipal sewage lines and the rotting contents of the kitchen refrigerator. The air was a stagnant, foul vapor. The devastation on the first floor was absolute. The surge had picked up the heavy oak dining table and driven it through the drywall of the formal living room. The leather sofas were waterlogged and overturned. The custom cabinetry in the kitchen hung by splintered hinges. The pristine suburban estate my father valued more than my life was reduced to a contaminated landfill. I waded through the knee-deep muck toward the heavy mahogany front doors. The rolled towel I had placed at the base of the frame 3 days ago was a blackened lump of sludge. The doors were swollen tight from the prolonged submersion. The moisture had expanded the wood fibers, sealing the doors into the frame like a cork in a bottle. I engaged the deadbolts and pulled the heavy brass handle. The door did not move. I braced my boots against the door jamb and pulled with my entire body weight. The swollen wood groaned but remained firmly wedged. I was not going to die in a dry house after surviving the flood. I stepped back. I raised the heavy roofing axe. I swung the sharp steel blade directly into the seam near the locking mechanism. The wood splintered. I swung again, aiming for the heavy brass hinges. The physical exertion burned my dehydrated muscles, but the adrenaline of impending freedom fueled my strikes. I hacked at the doorframe until the wood splintered enough to break the friction seal. I delivered one final kick near the base of the door. The mahogany panel cracked open, swinging outward onto the ruined porch. I stepped out of the dark house and into the blinding Louisiana sunlight. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue. The neighborhood of Mandeville looked like a war zone. The manicured lawns were gone, replaced by a thick, uneven layer of gray marsh mud. Broken tree limbs, displaced garbage cans, and the bloated carcasses of drowned animals littered the street. A thick coating of brown silt covered the sides of the neighboring houses, marking the high water line of the surge. I walked down the brick steps of the porch. The mud sucked at my boots, pulling me down with a heavy, viscous grip. I navigated across the ruined yard toward the perimeter of the property. The heavy wrought iron security gates still stood tall at the end of the driveway. The iron bars were choked with storm debris. Thick clusters of Spanish moss, broken pine branches, and tangled plastic tarps were woven tightly through the metal grates. The surge had battered the iron structure, but the deep concrete footings held firm. I waded through the remaining shallow water and approached the center latch. The manual steel deadbolt my father engaged from the outside was still locked securely in place. The gate had successfully prevented the Cajun Navy from executing a rescue. It had successfully turned the estate into a vault, and the lock remained unyielding. I reached into the pocket of my ruined jeans and pulled out my cell phone. The battery indicator displayed a flashing red sliver of power. For 3 days, the screen had displayed a fatal 0 bars of service. I held the phone up toward the sky, hoping to catch a stray signal bouncing off a surviving tower in St. Tammany Parish. The digital icon flickered. A single bar of LTE service appeared. Then a second bar. The local telecommunications crews had successfully restored a portable network node. The silence of the yard was immediately shattered by the rapid, relentless buzzing of the device in my palm. The phone vibrated violently as 3 days of delayed data flooded into the receiver. The screen illuminated with a barrage of notifications. 32 missed calls, 47 unread text messages, 5 voicemails. The notifications did not originate from the Coast Guard or the Regional Emergency Dispatch Center. They were not alerts from the Cajun Navy confirming a rescue timeline. The names attached to the messages were familiar and entirely expected. Louis, Evelyn, Julian. I stood in the toxic mud leaning against the iron gate. I opened the messaging application. I braced myself for the frantic, worried texts of a family desperate to know if their daughter survived the deadliest storm surge in a decade. I expected a timeline of escalating terror. I expected apologies for leaving me behind. I tapped the screen and opened the thread from my father. The first message arrived exactly 12 hours after the storm made landfall. It did not ask if I was breathing. The text read, "The news says the surge hit Mandeville. Is the roof intact? Did the water breach the first floor? Send pictures of the dining room." The subsequent messages followed a grim, predictable pattern. He demanded damage assessments. He instructed me to check the structural integrity of the raised concrete pilings. He ordered me to secure the remaining valuables against potential looters navigating the floodwaters. Not a single text inquired about my physical safety. The messages were instructions issued to a property manager. He viewed me as an extension of the real estate. I scrolled past his demands and opened the thread from my mother. Evelyn's messages were frantic, but the focus of her panic was entirely self-centered. Her initial text read, "Julian is terrified of the wind at the hotel. We lost power here in Baton Rouge. Please tell me the house is okay. We cannot afford to lose the estate." The realization hit me with a cold, dull ache. The isolation in the attic had already broken my trust, but seeing the digital proof of their priorities severed the final biological tether. They did not care that I bled into the fiberglass insulation. They did not care that I drank contaminated sludge from a ruined bathtub to survive. They only cared about the drywall. The phone vibrated again in my hand. A new text message appeared on the screen. The timestamp indicated it was sent just 2 minutes ago. It was from Louis. The message read, "The state police are clearing the highways. We are driving back to St. Tammany. We have nowhere else to go. Open the gate." I stared at the glowing screen. The battery icon flashed a desperate red warning. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard. The ingrained habit of obedience, forged over 31 years of acting as the family shock absorber, surged to the surface. I felt a sharp, pathetic pang of guilt. I actually started typing the numerical override code into a text message. I considered sending him the combination to bypass the deadbolt. I was about to face the most agonizing emotional hurdle of my life. I had to fight the urge to surrender my leverage and let my abusers back inside the perimeter. I stood in the thick gray mud of the ruined yard. The iron security gate pressed against my back. The Louisiana sun beat down on my shoulders, baking the stench of the receding floodwaters into the heavy, humid air. My cell phone vibrated violently in my dirty hand. I stared at the text message from my father. "We have nowhere else to go. Open the gate." He did not ask if I was capable of walking to the perimeter. He assumed I was standing by, ready to execute his commands. He viewed me as a highly functional appliance he had left plugged in during the storm. The screen shifted from the text thread to an incoming call notification. The caller identification displayed my mother's name, Evelyn. I hit the green accept button and pressed the cracked screen against my ear. The audio connection was jagged and filled with static. The background noise sounded chaotic. I heard the distinct, loud hum of industrial generators and the frantic, overlapping voices of hundreds of displaced people. Evelyn was standing in a crowded Federal Emergency Management Agency staging area in Baton Rouge. She did not say hello. She did not express relief at hearing my voice. She immediately launched into a hysterical, weeping monologue. "Natalie," she sobbed, her voice pitching high and breathless. "It is a nightmare here. The hotel lost power on the first night. We had to relocate to the convention center. Julian is having a panic attack. The cots are hard and the air conditioning is broken. We have not slept in 2 days. Lung. I closed my eyes. The sharp sting of the raw splinters in my palms throbbed in time with my pulse. I had spent 3 days trapped in an unventilated attic, baking in 100-degree heat. I drank toxic sludge from a ruined bathtub to prevent organ failure. And my mother was crying to me about the discomfort of a military cot. The state police just opened the interstate, Evelyn continued, her voice trembling. Your father is driving us back to Mandeville right now. We cannot stay in this staging area another hour. Julian is falling apart. Please tell me the house is dry. Please tell me we can just go home and sleep in our own beds. The agonizing weight of 31 years of emotional conditioning crashed over me. If you grow up in an ecosystem where you are the designated shock absorber, your brain wires itself to prioritize the comfort of your family over your own survival. You are taught that your pain is an acceptable currency to purchase their peace. When my brother Julian failed out of his business ventures, I absorbed the administrative cleanup. When my father Louis suffered his unhealed Katrina trauma, I absorbed his paranoia. I was the structural load-bearing wall of our family dynamic. I listened to my mother crying over the static-filled line. She sounded incredibly small and terrified. She was a 60-year-old woman who had never navigated a disaster without a comfortable safety net. A sharp, pathetic pang of guilt pierced my chest. I looked at the heavy iron gate. The thick metal deadbolt was engaged on the outside. My father possessed the physical key, but he had installed the secondary manual override keypad hidden inside the decorative ironwork near the hinges. He used it for emergency contractor access. I knew the numerical combination. If I sent him the code, they could bypass the lock. They could drive the heavy truck onto the property. They could step out of the vehicle and immediately take control of the narrative. Louis would assess the ruined drywall and begin drafting his fraudulent insurance claims. Evelyn would cry over the destroyed antique dining table. Julian would complain about the lack of internet service. They would reclaim their ownership of the disaster. And I would simply fade back into the background, the compliant, pragmatic daughter who guarded the estate exactly as instructed. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I opened the text messaging application. I selected my father's contact name. My thumbs were shaking. The dried mud flaked off my skin and fell onto the glass screen. I typed the 4-digit numerical override code into the text field, 3841. I stared at the glowing numbers. My thumb hovered a fraction of an inch above the blue send button. Sending that text was the path of least resistance. It was the easiest way to silence the hysterical crying on the phone line. It was the fastest way to return to the familiar, comfortable role I had played my entire life. The urge to surrender my leverage and let my abusers back inside the perimeter was intoxicating. I closed my eyes. The image of the Cajun Navy boat reversing away from the iron spikes flashed in my mind. I heard the metallic scrape of their aluminum hoe hitting the gate. I remembered the man at the bow telling me they had to leave because the barrier was too secure. Louis had locked me inside a watertight cage. He prioritized his fear of imaginary scavengers over my physical safety. He left me to drown. I opened my eyes. The guilt evaporated, burned away by the cold, hard truth of the Louisiana sun. I was not their shock absorber. I was the sole legal owner of the dirt beneath my boots. The sealed plastic folder sitting in my waterproof bag contained the final judgment from the St. Tammany Parish Court. I bought the tax certificate they abandoned. I quieted the title. I owned the estate. If I sent the override code, I was inviting trespassers onto my property. If I let them inside the gate, I was giving them the opportunity to commit federal insurance fraud on an asset that belonged exclusively to my blind limited liability company. I pressed the backspace key. I deleted the number 1. I deleted the 4. I deleted the 8. I deleted the 3. The text field was empty. I raised the phone back to my ear. Evelyn was still crying, begging me to confirm that the house was ready for their arrival. "The first floor is gone," I said. My voice was a flat, raspy croak. I had not spoken aloud since screaming at the rising water 3 days ago. "The surge topped 10 feet. The furniture is destroyed." Evelyn gasped. The sound was a sharp intake of pure horror. No, Natalie. Your father said the raised foundation would hold. He said the water would not breach the doors." "He was wrong," I replied, the clinical detachment returning to my tone. "The house is unlivable." "We are coming anyway," Evelyn sobbed. "Your father said we have to strip the remaining valuables before the insurance adjusters arrive. He said we have to claim a total loss. Just open the gate when we get there." I did not argue with her. Arguing with an enabler is a useless expenditure of energy. I simply pressed the red button and ended the call. I slipped the phone back into the pocket of my ruined jeans. The battery died a second later. The screen went permanently black. I walked away from the iron gate. I did not return to the ruined house. I walked toward the edge of the driveway and sat down on a large, overturned oak branch that the storm had dragged across the yard. I unrolled the top of my orange waterproof go bag. I pulled out the sealed plastic folder containing the legal documents. I rested the heavy stock paper on my lap. I had survived the Category 4 hurricane. I had survived the suffocating isolation of the attic. I had survived the toxic, contaminated water. Now the final storm was driving down the interstate toward Mandeville. I sat on the broken tree branch and waited for the heavy-duty truck to arrive. I was no longer a daughter waiting for a rescue. I was a landlord preparing to serve an eviction notice. I sat on the overturned oak branch for 2 hours. The Louisiana sun baked the toxic mud across the yard into a cracked gray crust. The silence of the ruined neighborhood was heavy and oppressive. The only sound was the occasional distant hum of a Coast Guard helicopter flying grid patterns over Lake Pontchartrain. I held the sealed plastic folder on my lap. The legal documents inside were the only clean items remaining on the property. At precisely 1 in the afternoon, the low mechanical rumble of a heavy-duty diesel engine broke the quiet. I looked toward the end of the driveway. A large, dark pickup truck turned off the main road and approached the perimeter of the estate. The vehicle navigated slowly around the scattered debris and submerged garbage cans. It stopped abruptly a few feet away from the heavy iron security gates. The driver's side door opened. Louis stepped out onto the asphalt. He wore clean denim jeans and a crisp polo shirt. He looked rested. He looked exactly like a man who had spent the last 3 days sitting in an air-conditioned hotel room in Baton Rouge while a Category 4 hurricane drowned his parish. Evelyn and Julian emerged from the passenger side. My mother clutched a designer handbag against her chest. Julian wore his expensive sneakers. They both looked pristine and entirely out of place against the backdrop of catastrophic destruction. They walked up to the iron gate. They grabbed the thick vertical bars and peered through the metal grates. I stood up from the oak branch. I did not wave. I did not rush toward them. I walked slowly across the ruined yard. My boots dragged through the heavy silt. My clothes were stiff with dried swamp water and raw sewage. The crude bandages I had fashioned from a torn shirt were wrapped tightly around the bleeding palms of my hands. My face was streaked with dried mud and plaster dust. I stopped 10 feet away from the interior side of the gate. We stared at each other through the iron bars. The physical contrast between us was staggering. They were the affluent suburban family returning from a vacation. I was the casualty they left behind to guard the vault. Evelyn gasped. She dropped her designer handbag on the dirty asphalt. She pressed her hands against her mouth. "Natalie," she cried, her voice trembling. "Look at you. You are bleeding. What happened?" Julian took a step back from the gate. He grimaced, clearly repulsed by the foul smell of the stagnant water radiating from my clothes. He crossed his arms over his chest. "The house looks terrible," he complained, his tone whining and self-centered. "Did the water get up to the second floor? My gaming setup was in the guest room." I did not answer my brother. I kept my gaze locked on my father. Louis did not ask about my bleeding hands. He did not ask how I survived the surge. He looked past me, his eyes scanning the shattered French doors and the ruined first floor of the Acadian estate. The trauma of 2005 flared in his pupils. He was calculating the loss of his physical footprint. He gripped the iron bars. He shook the gate, rattling the heavy deadbolt he had engaged 3 days ago. "The water breached the foundation," Louis stated. His voice was a low, authoritative bark. He was slipping immediately back into the role of the commanding patriarch. "You should have stacked the sandbags higher against the patio doors like I told you." The sheer audacity of his critique hit me like a physical blow. He was reprimanding me for failing to hold back a localized tsunami with canvas bags filled with dirt. He was blaming the shock absorber for failing to stop the crash. I looked him in the eye. The cold, clinical detachment I used in my corporate career fortified my spine. "The surge topped 10 feet, Louis. The lake bypassed the elevation certificates. Sandbags do not stop the ocean." My father ignored the reality of the physics. He rattled the gate again. "The damage is done," he commanded. "We have to move fast. I called the insurance broker from the hotel this morning. I initiated the commercial claim process. I told them the wind compromised the roof and the structural framing before the water arrived. We are filing for a total catastrophic loss." He pointed a blunt finger at me through the iron spikes. "We need to get inside right now. We have to strip the antique furniture, the electronics, and the remaining copper fixtures before the federal adjusters get here. I am not letting the government or the scavengers take a single dime of my equity. Go to the keypad and punch in the manual override. Open the gate." I stood perfectly still in the mud. The pieces of his strategy clicked together in my mind. The puzzle was complete, and the picture it formed was vile. Louis did not just return to survey the damage. He returned to manipulate the timeline of the disaster. As a commercial claims adjuster, I intimately understand the notorious wind versus flood dispute that has plagued Louisiana since Katrina. Standard homeowners insurance covers wind damage. It explicitly excludes flood damage caused by a storm surge. To cover flood damage, a homeowner must purchase a separate, expensive policy through the National Flood Insurance Program. If the surge destroys a house, the standard carrier denies the claim. But if the homeowner can prove the hurricane-force winds destroyed the roof and shattered the structural integrity before the water arrived, the standard carrier is legally obligated to pay out a massive settlement. My father was intending to commit blatant federal insurance fraud. He wanted to strip the remaining valuable assets from the house, claim they were destroyed by the wind, and secure a massive payout from the corporate carrier. He wanted to manipulate the crime scene before the official adjusters arrived to investigate the forensic evidence. He was demanding I open the gate so he could execute a felony on my property. I looked down at the sealed plastic folder resting against my hip. I had spent 3 years silently acquiring the tax certificate for this estate. I had filed the petition for monition. The judge had signed the final judgment quieting the title. The dirt beneath my boots, the ruined structure, and the commercial insurance policy attached to the address belonged exclusively to my blind limited liability company. I was not just an exhausted daughter standing in the mud. I was the sole legal owner of a disaster zone, and the man demanding entry was a trespasser preparing to commit fraud on my asset. The primal terror of the storm was gone. The emotional breakdown in the bathtub was a forgotten memory. I was operating purely on the cold, ruthless logic of the market. The final confrontation was no longer a family dispute. It was a corporate eviction. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the iron bars. I did not reach for the numerical keypad. I reached into the waterproof bag. It was time to show my father the exact legal mechanism I had engineered to correct his failures. I stood inches away from the heavy wrought iron gate. The heat radiating off the asphalt on the dry side of the perimeter created a faint, shimmering mirage between the steel bars. Louis gripped the iron grates. He expected immediate compliance. He expected the designated shock absorber to punch the 4-digit override code and swing the heavy doors open so he could begin his salvage operation. I did not move toward the keypad. The cold, professional disgust settling in my chest overrode any lingering biological loyalty. I am a commercial claims adjuster. I spend my days working directly with the National Flood Insurance Program and corporate carriers. I evaluate the forensic evidence of ruin. I can look at a splintered joist and tell you if it snapped from the torsional twisting of a Category 4 wind gust or if it buckled under the blunt force hydrostatic pressure of a tidal surge. Louis wanted to claim the wind destroyed the house before the water arrived. He wanted to secure a massive payout from his standard homeowner's policy to fund a new life elsewhere. I looked my father in the eye. You cannot claim wind damage on the foundation, Louis. The roof held. The shingles are mostly intact. The surge breached the French doors. The water destroyed the interior. That is a strict flood claim. My father scowled. He rattled the heavy iron gate again, his frustration bleeding through his confident facade. Do not lecture me on insurance protocols, Natalie, he barked. His voice carried the sharp, patronizing tone he always used when someone challenged his authority. The adjusters are swamped. They are handling 10,000 claims this week. They will not send a forensic engineer to inspect the framing of a single residential property. They will look at the photos we provide, write the check, and close the file. We are going to tell them the wind blew the doors out and compromised the structure. He pointed a finger at me through the bars. Now open the gate so we can get the antique dining set and the copper wiring out of here before the federal inspectors show up. The sheer audacity of his plan was staggering. He was not just asking me to facilitate his entry, he was asking me to become an active accessory to a federal crime. Under the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, filing a fraudulent claim during a federally declared disaster is a felony aggressively prosecuted by the Department of Justice. He was willing to risk federal prison to recoup the value of his furniture. I am not opening the gate, I stated. My voice was level, devoid of any emotional fluctuation, and you are not filing that claim. Evelyn gasped. She took a step back from the perimeter. Julian stopped complaining about his gaming console and stared at me in profound confusion. My refusal to comply with a direct command from the patriarch was a structural violation of our family dynamic. Louis narrowed his eyes. The irritation morphed into genuine anger. What did you say? I said you are not filing a fraudulent wind claim, I repeated. I reached into the pocket of my ruined jeans and pulled out my dead cell phone. The cracked screen reflected the harsh Louisiana sunlight. I held the device up so he could see it. I am a licensed adjuster, Louis, I explained, delivering the facts with surgical precision. I know exactly how the corporate carriers investigate these disputes. When the lake breached the property line, I did not just run upstairs. I documented the entire timeline. I took time-stamped, high-resolution photographs of the water level rising against the foundation. I recorded video of the French doors buckling under the hydrostatic pressure. The metadata on my device proves the surge destroyed the house. The wind did not compromise the structure. I lowered the dead phone. If you try to submit a total loss wind claim, the carrier will request the forensic data. I will hand them my phone. They will deny your claim immediately and forward your file to the Federal Fraud Division. The color returned to my father's face. It was not the healthy flush of relief. It was a dark, mottled red, fueled by pure, unadulterated rage. The unhealed trauma of 2005, the deep-seated fear of losing his physical footprint, hijacked his rational mind. He slammed his fists against the iron bars. The heavy gate shuddered violently. "You ungrateful, stupid girl," he screamed. His voice echoed down the ruined street. "I built this estate with my bare hands. I gave you a roof over your head. I left you here to protect my legacy, and you are threatening to report me to the insurance company over a technicality?" He leaned close to the metal grates. The spittle flew from his lips. He completely abandoned the illusion of paternal care. "That payout is the only way we survive this," he yelled, his tone dripping with malice. "Julian lost everything in Covington. I drained my retirement to save your brother from bankruptcy. We need that insurance check to buy a new house in Baton Rouge. We need that money. And you are going to stand in the mud and play the self-righteous corporate auditor?" He stopped yelling and took a ragged breath. He looked at me with absolute contempt. "I should have left the gate open and let the looters take you," he sneered. "You care more about a corporate rule book than you care about your own family." The silence that followed his statement was heavy and absolute. Evelyn sobbed quietly behind him. Julian looked at the ground, unwilling to meet my gaze. My father had finally spoken the quiet part out loud. He did not care that I bled into the fiberglass insulation of the attic. He did not care that I survived the sweltering heat and the toxic sludge. He only cared about the financial yield of the disaster. He was willing to sacrifice my physical safety to guard the house, and he was willing to sacrifice my professional license to secure the payout. I was nothing more than a tool he deployed to protect his golden child. The emotional conditioning that had kept me tethered to this family for 31 years finally shattered. The guilt evaporated. The biological loyalty dissolved into the contaminated mud beneath my boots. I did not yell back. I did not cry. I experienced a profound, cold liberation. I was no longer an obedient daughter arguing with an abusive father. I was a property owner dealing with a hostile trespasser. I unrolled the top of the bright orange waterproof go bag slung across my chest. I reached inside and pulled out the sealed plastic folder. The final confrontation was not going to be settled with screaming or physical force. It was going to be settled with ink, paper, and the brutal efficiency of the Louisiana tax code. I walked the final 2 feet to the wrought iron gate. The heat radiating off the asphalt mixed with the foul smell of the receding floodwaters. Louis gripped the vertical bars. His knuckles were white. He glared at me, waiting for my defiance to break under the weight of his anger. He expected the obedient daughter to finally apologize, punch the numerical override code into the keypad, and swing the heavy steel doors open. I did not reach for the keypad. I held the sealed plastic folder. I unzipped the top edge and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy stock paper. I did not throw the papers at him. I maintained the clinical precision I used to audit multi-million-dollar insurance portfolios. I turned the stack sideways and slid the documents through the narrow gap between the iron bars. "Take it," I commanded. My voice was a flat, unyielding croak. Louis frowned. The sudden introduction of formal paperwork derailed his momentum. He expected an emotional argument, not a legal filing. He released his grip on the gate and took the stack of papers. He looked down at the top page. The bold black text at the header read, "Final Judgment, Quieting Title." The official raised seal of the St. Tammany Parish Court gleamed in the Louisiana sunlight. He read the first paragraph, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He read the second paragraph. The blood began to drain from his face, returning him to the pale, sickly color he wore when the surge first breached the neighborhood. "What is this?" Louis demanded. His voice lost its booming authority. It sounded thin and hollow. "It is an eviction notice," I stated. Julian stepped closer, peering over our father's shoulder. Evelyn stopped sobbing and wiped her eyes, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in the power dynamic. I did not wait for Louis to process the complex legal jargon. I dismantled his reality piece by meticulous piece. 3 years ago, you stopped paying the parish property taxes, I began, delivering the facts like a forensic auditor reading a ledger. You drained your retirement accounts to bail Julian out of his failed restaurant lease in Covington. You chose to save his ego instead of paying the municipal government. Julian flushed a dark, angry red. He opened his mouth to defend his business acumen, but I cut him off before he could speak a single word. You assumed you could float the delinquency, I continued, keeping my focus entirely on my father. You assumed the parish operated slowly. You did not understand the efficiency of the Louisiana Department of Revenue. Louis stared at the stamped document. His hands began to tremble. The edges of the heavy stock paper rattled against the iron bars. When you miss a tax payment in this state, the parish does not evict you immediately, I explained, forcing him to listen to the exact mechanism of his ruin. They auction a tax certificate to a third-party investor. An out-of-state holding company purchased the lien on this estate. You were granted a strict 36-month redemptive period to pay them back with statutory interest. I took a slow, ragged breath. My throat burned. You never paid them, Louis. You hosted Sunday dinners. You mowed the lawn. You maintained the illusion of wealth while the clock ticked down to 0. Louis looked up from the paper. His eyes were wide with a profound, creeping terror. He was a man defined entirely by his physical footprint, and he was realizing his footprint had vanished. The holding company did not want the physical property, I said, delivering the final, lethal blow to his ego. They only wanted the interest yield. So I bought the tax certificate from them 2 years ago. I transferred the lien into a blind, limited liability company registered under my name. I became the investor holding the debt on your estate. Evelyn gasped loudly. Natalie, how could you? We are your family. You left me behind to guard a house you technically abandoned, I replied, not looking at my mother. You locked me in a cage to protect your antique dining table. You valued the drywall more than my life. Do not speak to me about family. I returned my attention to my father. He was visibly shaking now. The unhealed trauma of Hurricane Katrina, the deep-seated fear of losing his legacy, was colliding violently with the undeniable proof of his own failure. When the 3-year redemptive window closed, I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet, ruined street, I filed a petition for monition. The legal notices were published in the back of the local newspaper. You never read them. You missed the final warning. I pointed a dirty, bleeding finger at the document in his hands. The judge reviewed the timeline. The taxes remained unredeemed. 5 days before this hurricane formed in the Gulf, the judge brought his gavel down. He signed the final judgment. He formally stripped you of all rights and quieted the title. Louis looked down at the signature on the bottom line of the page. He saw the name of My Blind LLC. He saw the legal transfer of ownership. I own the dirt you are standing on, I concluded. I own the ruined structure. And I own the commercial insurance policy attached to this address. You have 0 legal standing to file a claim, fraudulent or otherwise. If you legally owned the house your toxic family abandoned you in, would you let them inside to get their belongings? Let me know below. The silence that descended over the perimeter was absolute. The mechanical hum of the distant rescue helicopters faded into the background. The patriarch, who had spent his entire life trying to control his environment by controlling his assets, had just discovered a fatal structural flaw in his universe. He had built an impenetrable fortress to keep scavengers out. He engaged the manual deadbolt on the iron gate and pocketed the physical key. He thought he was locking me inside to protect his legacy. He did not realize he had just successfully locked himself out of my property. The confrontation was no longer a family dispute. It was a finalized corporate transaction. And my father was about to learn that true ownership requires far more than holding a key. Lewis lowered the stamped judgment. The heavy stock paper hung loosely from his fingertips. The rugged, patriarchal authority he carried for decades evaporated into the humid Louisiana air. He looked like a deflated shell of a man. The undeniable proof of his profound financial failure stripped away the commanding exterior he used to navigate the world. He was a man who measured his entire worth by the physical dirt he controlled, and the dirt was gone. Julian broke the heavy silence. My older brother stepped up to the wrought iron gate. The toes of his pristine, expensive sneakers sank into the thick gray marsh mud coating the asphalt. He glared at me through the metal bars, his face twisted into a mask of pure, entitled outrage. Julian demanded to know what the legal paperwork meant for his future. He yelled that the Mandeville estate was his inheritance. He whined about the years he spent expecting to receive a portion of the property value. He complained that I had stolen his safety net and ruined his financial trajectory. He acted as though my survival was an inconvenient roadblock to his personal wealth. I looked at the 34-year-old man who still expected his parents to fund his existence. I did not raise my voice. I dismantled his delusion with surgical precision. I told Julian he never possessed an inheritance. I reminded him of the sleek custom leather booths and the imported espresso machines he purchased for his failed restaurant venture in Covington. I explained the grim mathematics of his business failure. I stated that our father drained his retirement accounts to pay off the angry seafood distributors and the commercial lease penalties, just to save the family name from the public court dockets. I kept my tone flat and even. I informed Julian that his restaurant debt was the exact reason the St. Tammany Parish property taxes went unpaid. I told him he ate his own inheritance 3 years ago. I stated that my decision to purchase the tax certificate merely formalized the loss he had already caused. Julian opened his mouth to argue, but the facts offered zero room for negotiation. He looked at Louis, seeking a defense. My father did not defend him. Louis stared at the cracked asphalt, unable to formulate a response to the undeniable truth. Evelyn tried to intervene. My mother stepped forward, clutching her designer handbag. She employed her classic tactic of utilizing maternal guilt to smooth over catastrophic friction. She wept softly. She pleaded with me to remember that we were a family. She begged me to open the gate so we could sit down inside the ruined house and sort out the misunderstanding like civilized people. She claimed my father was just trying to do what was best for everyone when he left me behind. I looked at the woman who sat in the air-conditioned cabin of a heavy-duty pickup truck while her husband handed me a roofing axe. I felt zero biological loyalty. I told Evelyn there was no misunderstanding to sort out. I explained that civilized people do not lock their children inside a flood zone to guard antique furniture. I stated that she forfeited the right to use the word family the moment she watched the taillights of that truck disappear down the road. Louis finally found his voice. It was a raspy, desperate sound. The reality of the quieted title had crushed his ego, but his mind scrambled to find a lingering loophole. The trauma of his past pushed him to seek a final, desperate payout. He pointed a trembling finger at the ruined Acadian structure behind me. He insisted the property was insured under his name. He claimed he had paid the premiums on the standard homeowner's policy for 2 decades. He argued that the corporate carrier owed him the settlement for the catastrophic wind damage, regardless of who currently held the deed. He stated he was going to process the claim and take the settlement check to rebuild in Baton Rouge. As a commercial claims adjuster, I deal with the intricacies of policy law every single day. I shut down his final escape route with the cold, undeniable reality of the Louisiana Insurance Code. I explained the legal concept of insurable interest. I told my father that a corporate carrier cannot legally issue a settlement check to an individual who does not possess a vested financial stake in the damaged asset. I stated that the moment the parish judge signed the final judgment quieting the title, 5 days before the hurricane, Louis lost all insurable interest in the estate. I delivered the final blow to his fraudulent plan. I informed him that the blind limited liability company registered under my name was now the sole entity holding the insurable interest. I told him I had already updated the commercial policy records using my corporate underwriting access. The carrier knew the title had transferred. I looked him in the eye and promised that if he attempted to file a total loss wind claim, the carrier would deny the payout immediately. I assured him the Federal Fraud Division would launch an investigation into his actions. I stated that I would be processing the commercial flood claim myself. I told him he had exactly 0 legal standing to collect a single dime from the ruin. The transaction was complete. I had stripped away his dirt, his legacy, and his fraudulent escape hatch. I took a slow step backward in the thick mud. I gestured toward the heavy wrought iron gate separating us. I told Louis to look at the iron bars. I reminded him of the morning the storm approached. I recounted how he pulled those heavy gates together, engaged the manual steel deadbolt on the exterior latch, and pocketed the physical key. I explained his rationale. I noted he wanted to turn the estate into an impenetrable vault to keep scavengers away from his legacy. I looked at his pale, defeated face. I told him he had engineered a flawless defense system. I pointed out the profound poetry of his paranoia. I stated that the locked gate he used to trap me inside a watertight cage was now the exact physical barrier keeping him out of my multi-million-dollar asset. He had successfully locked himself out of his own life. The silence hanging over the ruined neighborhood was deep and final. The power dynamic had permanently shifted. The patriarch who dictated every movement of our family for 3 decades was reduced to a trespasser standing on a public street. I delivered my final instructions. I did not raise my voice. The authority of ownership resonated in every syllable. I informed Louis, Evelyn, and Julian that they were currently standing at the perimeter of private commercial property. I stated they had no legal right to enter the premises. I told them to get back into their heavy-duty pickup truck and drive back to the federal staging area in Baton Rouge. I warned them that if they attempted to scale the iron gate or bypass the deadbolt, I would utilize the remaining battery power on my emergency radio to contact the parish sheriff and request an immediate arrest for trespassing in a declared disaster zone. I turned my back on my family. I did not wait to watch them process the eviction. I walked away from the iron perimeter. My boots dragged through the heavy, toxic mud, but my shoulders felt lighter than they had in 31 years. The grueling isolation of the sweltering attic was over. The psychological debt of being a designated shock absorber was canceled. I was walking back toward a ruined house, but for the first time in my life, the foundation belonged entirely to me. I heard the heavy diesel engine of my father's truck rumble to life behind me. The sound was distinct in the otherwise silent, ruined neighborhood. I did not turn around to watch them leave. I listened to the tires crush the scattered debris on the asphalt as they reversed away from the iron gates. They were driving back to Baton Rouge, defeated by the very legal and financial systems they had chosen to ignore. The patriarch who tried to control his legacy through paranoia had lost it all to a daughter who understood paperwork. The following weeks were a grueling marathon of physical and administrative labor, but it was labor executed on my own terms. The St. Tammany Parish roads eventually cleared. The federal response team stabilized the grid. I did not sit in the mud waiting for a rescue. I initiated my own recovery. I leveraged my professional network as a commercial claims adjuster to secure a top-tier remediation crew before the local demand skyrocketed. I used my corporate savings to pay their initial retainer. They arrived with heavy equipment, industrial dehumidifiers, and hazmat suits. They stripped the ruined drywall down to the structural studs, hauled the waterlogged antique furniture to the curb, and treated the oak framing for mold. I officially filed the commercial flood claim through the National Flood Insurance Program under the name of my blind limited liability company. Because I had the time-stamped photos of the lake breaching the first floor, and because the title was crystal clear, the adjusting process was seamless. The federal payout was substantial. It was more than enough to cover the remediation, rebuild the first floor to modern hurricane code standards, and establish a comfortable emergency reserve fund. I never received another text message from my father. Evelyn tried to call me twice from a restricted number, leaving weeping voicemails begging for a portion of the insurance settlement to help Julian rent a new apartment. I deleted the voicemails without listening to the end. The biological tether was permanently severed. I was no longer the designated shock absorber for their failures. Looking back at the dark, sweltering attic, the toxic sludge in the bathtub, and the heavy iron gates that nearly became my tomb, I realized that surviving a disaster, both natural and familial, requires a fundamental restructuring of how you view your own value. If you are currently sitting in a room where your safety is being traded to protect someone else's comfort, I want to share 5 vital lessons I learned from the flood. First, trauma explains toxic behavior, but it does not excuse it. My father was profoundly damaged by Hurricane Katrina. He watched scavengers erase his childhood home, and that fear hijacked his brain. He built a fortress and locked me inside because his trauma dictated his logic. But understanding his pain did not obligate me to die for it. You can recognize why a person is broken without allowing their sharp edges to cut you to pieces. Second, a locked door protects the person holding the key, no one else. My family framed the iron gates and the deadbolt as a security measure for my benefit. They claimed it would keep the looters out. In reality, it was designed to protect their antique dining table while turning my environment into a cage that blocked the Cajun Navy. Whenever someone imposes a strict boundary on your life and calls it protection, look closely at who actually holds the power to open the lock. Third, legal paperwork outlasts emotional manipulation. When Evelyn cried on the phone from the staging area, 30 years of emotional conditioning almost made me text them the override code. Guilt is a powerful, blinding force. But guilt cannot override a final judgment quieting title signed by a parish judge. My family expected me to fold under their demands, but I defeated their entitlement using the cold, undeniable reality of the Louisiana tax code. Spite fades, but a recorded deed is permanent. Fourth, you cannot be the shock absorber for people who view you as collateral damage. I spent my 20s fixing Julianne's administrative disasters and absorbing my father's paranoia. I thought my pragmatic resilience made me valuable to them. I learned the hard way that when the water rises, toxic people will always use your strength as an excuse to abandon you. Stop setting yourself on fire to keep people warm who would gladly lock you in a burning house. Fifth, true ownership means standing your ground when the water rises. I did not just buy a tax certificate. I earned that estate by bleeding into the fiberglass insulation. I earned it by drinking contaminated water and hacking my way through a swollen mahogany door with a roofing axe. The property does not belong to the person who mows the lawn in the sunshine. It belongs to the person who holds the line when the storm surge hits. The remediation crew finished the dry-out phase last week. The house is currently a skeleton of clean, treated pine studs resting on solid concrete pilings. It smells like bleach and fresh lumber instead of swamp mud and decay. I walk the perimeter every morning with a cup of coffee. The iron gates are still there at the end of the driveway, but the heavy manual deadbolt has been removed. I installed a modern electronic keypad on the inside of the property. I control the access. My name is Natalie. I am 31 years old. I am a commercial claims adjuster, and I live on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. The storm took the drywall, the furniture, and the illusions I held about my family, but it left behind the foundation, and for the first time in my life, that foundation belongs entirely to me. The heavy diesel engine of my father's truck rumbled away. I stood in the thick mud and watched my toxic history leave my property. Over the next few weeks, I initiated the recovery on my own terms. I did not rely on risky schemes. Following the rampant post-storm FEMA disaster fraud that plagued Louisiana under the Stafford Act, the federal government heavily scrutinized every requested payout. But I am a licensed adjuster. I bypassed the bureaucratic traps. I filed my claim directly through the National Flood Insurance Program. I provided my time-stamped photos and the final judgment from the parish court. The adjusters approved the structural payout within 30 days. I hired a professional remediation crew to strip the ruined drywall down to the bare pine studs. The house smells like bleach and fresh timber now. Looking back at the sweltering attic and the toxic sludge, I realized surviving a disaster requires a fundamental restructuring of your own value. I learned 5 vital lessons. First, trauma explains toxic behavior, but it does not excuse it. My father was broken by his past. His fear of scavengers dictated his logic. Understanding his pain did not obligate me to die for it. You can recognize why a person is damaged without letting their sharp edges cut you. Second, a locked door protects the person holding the key and no one else. My family called that iron gate a security measure. In reality, it was a cage that blocked the rescue boats. Whenever someone imposes a strict boundary on your life and calls it protection, look closely at who controls the lock. Third, legal paperwork outlasts emotional manipulation. Guilt is a blinding force, but tears and hysterical phone calls cannot override a Louisiana tax deed and a parish judge's signature. Spite fades, but a recorded deed is permanent. Fourth, you cannot be the shock absorber for people who view you as collateral damage. I spent my 20s fixing my brother's financial disasters. I learned that when the water rises, toxic people will always use your strength as an excuse to abandon you. Fifth, true ownership means standing your ground when the flood hits. I earned this estate by bleeding into the fiberglass insulation and hacking through a swollen door with a roofing axe. The property belongs to the person who holds the line. I installed a new electronic keypad on the iron gate. I control the access now. Thank you for listening to my journey. If my survival resonated with your own fight for independence, please subscribe to Maya Tells Stories. Your subscription is earnestly requested and deeply vital. It helps this channel be maintained and further developed so Maya can continue bringing you more fascinating stories of resilience and justice. Hit the like button and share your verdict in the comments. Protect your peace, secure your leverage, and I will see you in the next